When trucks started dumping millions of bees into Nevada's desert soil, everybody thought it was the dumbest farming idea ever. Social media exploded with videos of farmers literally pouring bees onto salt-covered ground that looked more like a wasteland than a farm. Agricultural experts called it animal cruelty. Neighbors thought the farmers had lost their minds. Local news stations ran stories about Nevada's crazy bee experiment that seemed destined to fail spectacularly. Those same people who had mocked and criticized Nevada's bold strategy were desperately trying to copy what its farmers had done, realizing they had completely misjudged something that would change agriculture forever. The farming disaster. Nevada's farmers were facing a crisis that threatened to destroy their entire way of life. The desert state had always struggled with agriculture, but by 2023, things were getting desperate. Crop yields were dropping every year, and traditional farming methods just weren't working anymore in the increasingly harsh conditions. The problem wasn't just the obvious desert climate. Nevada's soil was becoming more and more alkaline each year due to mineral deposits left behind by ancient lakes. Regular crops couldn't handle the salty conditions, and farmers were spending fortune after fortune trying to fix soil that seemed determined to stay broken. But there was one crop that somehow thrived in these terrible conditions: alfalfa. This purple-flowered plant had deep roots that could reach water sources other crops couldn't access. More importantly, alfalfa was incredibly valuable. Farmers could make serious money growing it, especially if they could harvest the seeds instead of just the hay. In fact, alfalfa seeds and the plants that are born from them are able to retain water in the soil, making sure future crops don't suffer too much in case of sudden droughts. But here's where things got tricky. Alfalfa seeds only form when the flowers get pollinated in a very specific way. The flower petals work like a tiny catapult that has to be triggered by the right kind of pressure. Most bees, including the honeybees that farmers normally use, either can't trigger this mechanism or simply refuse to do it. Because it is uncomfortable. Without proper pollination, alfalfa plants would produce lots of flowers, but very few seeds. Farmers were losing thousands of dollars every season because their beautiful purple fields weren't making the seeds they desperately needed to stay in business. Something had to change fast, but the solution they eventually chose would make them the laughingstock of the entire agricultural world. The answer lay buried in Nevada's own history, with a type of bee that most people had never heard of, and definitely didn't understand. The strange discovery in ancient research. Dr. Clara Martinez was digging through old agricultural research papers when she found something that made her stop everything she was doing. Buried in a 1970 study was information about a native Nevada bee species that seemed almost too good to be true. These bees, called alkali bees, were apparently perfect alfalfa pollinators that had been living in Nevada for thousands of years. The research showed that alkali bees had a completely different lifestyle from regular honeybees. Instead of living in hives and making honey, these bees were loners who built underground homes in salty soil. Each female would dig her own tunnel system and raise her babies in individual underground chambers. What made Dr. Martinez's heart race was reading about how these bees interacted with alfalfa flowers. Unlike honeybees that avoided the flower's snapping mechanism, alkali bees seemed to love it. When they landed on alfalfa flowers, their size and weight triggered the pollination mechanism perfectly every single time. They were like tiny keys made specifically for alfalfa's locks. But there was a major problem. Alkali bee populations had crashed decades ago due to pesticide use and habitat destruction. The very bees that could save Nevada's alfalfa industry had almost disappeared from the landscape. Dr. Martinez realized that if farmers could somehow bring these bees back, they might solve their pollination crisis. The challenge was figuring out how to recreate the specific conditions alkali bees needed to thrive. The research papers mentioned that these bees required salty, moist soil in very particular configurations. They needed areas where they could dig easily, but where their tunnels wouldn't collapse. Most importantly, they needed salt levels that would kill most other insects, but somehow helped alkali bees flourish. Dr. Martinez started reaching out to Nevada farmers with her findings, but most people thought her ideas sounded completely crazy. The concept of intentionally creating salty desert areas to attract millions of ground-nesting bees seemed like science fiction. Several farmers hung up on her when she explained that they would need to dump salt on their land and then release millions of bees into the prepared soil. Only a few desperate farmers were willing to try her wild experiment, not knowing they were about to become either heroes or the most mocked people in Nevada's farming history. The experiment that made headlines. When farmer Bill Richardson agreed to try Dr. Martinez's alkali bee experiment, he had no idea that local news crews would soon be filming him dumping millions of bees into what looked like a giant salt flat. The images that spread across social media made Nevada farming look like a complete joke to the rest of the agricultural world. Bill's first step was preparing a 5-acre section of his property specifically for the bee experiment. Workers used special equipment to create the perfect soil consistency. Loose enough for digging, but stable enough to support tunnel systems. Then came the part that made everyone think Bill had lost his mind. Covering the entire area with a thick layer of salt. The salt application process looked absolutely insane to outside observers. Trucks delivered ton after ton of salt that workers spread across the prepared soil like they were trying to kill everything that might want to grow there. Local residents driving by would stop and take pictures, posting online about the crazy farmer who's salting his own land. Next, Bill installed an underground. Nobody could see from the surface. This hidden network of pipes and sensors would keep the soil at exactly the right moisture level for bee tunnels. The system was incredibly expensive and complicated, requiring constant monitoring and adjustment. Critics pointed out that Bill was spending more money on underground watering systems than most farmers spent on their entire irrigation setup. Finally came the moment that made national news: the bee delivery. Specialized trucks arrived carrying millions of alkali bees that had been carefully bred and prepared for release. The sight of workers literally dumping millions of live bees onto salt-covered desert soil looked so ridiculous that video clips went viral on social media. Comments poured in from farming experts, environmentalists, and regular people who couldn't understand what Nevada farmers were thinking. This is animal cruelty, some claimed. Those bees will die in the desert. Others predicted. Agricultural professors used Bill's experiment as an example of misguided farming practices in their university lectures. The negative attention was overwhelming. Bill started getting hate mail from people who thought he was torturing bees for some crazy agricultural experiment. But Bill and Dr. Martinez knew they had to wait at least a month before they could judge whether their mocked experiment was working or failing spectacularly. The underground mystery nobody could solve. While critics continued mocking Nevada's bee dumping experiment, something extraordinary was happening beneath the salt-crusted surface that nobody could see or understand. The millions of bees that everyone assumed would die in the desert were actually thriving in ways that defied conventional wisdom about bee behavior. Within days of their release, the alkali bees began exhibiting behaviors that amazed Dr. Martinez and confused everyone else. Instead of flying away to find a more suitable habitat, the bees started digging. Each female bee would land on the salt crust, somehow sense the perfect conditions below, and begin excavating her own personal tunnel system. The digging process was unlike anything most people had ever seen bees do. Each bee would use her head and front legs to break through the salt crust, then continue digging straight down into the specially prepared soil below. The tunnels they created were perfectly round and surprisingly deep, going down 12 to 18 inches before branching off into horizontal chambers. What fascinated Dr. Martinez was how the bees seemed to know exactly where to dig. They didn't randomly scatter across the 5-acre bed, but instead chose specific spots that created an efficient underground network. Some areas became dense with tunnels, while other sections remained untouched, as if the bees were following some invisible blueprint. The salt that everyone thought would harm the bees was actually helping them in multiple ways. It kept the soil at the perfect moisture level for tunnel construction and prevented other insects from invading the bee nesting area. The salt also created alkaline conditions that naturally protected the developing bee babies from diseases and parasites that thrived in regular soil. Underground, each female bee was creating nursery chambers where she would store pollen and nectar before laying a single egg. The babies would develop safely in these individual rooms, protected by the salt-infused soil and careful moisture control from Bill's hidden irrigation system. But the most amazing part was how quickly the population was growing. Each successful female could produce multiple offspring that would mature and start their own tunnels in the same area. Instead of a one-time bee release, Bill's salt-covered desert was becoming a self-sustaining bee city that would keep growing larger and more productive every year. However, the real test was still coming. Nobody would know if Nevada's mock strategy actually worked until the bees started interacting with the alfalfa crop. That's when the true success or failure of dumping millions of bees into the desert would finally be revealed.